All right, can everybody hear us?
Somebody online give us Michael. Okay. Okay,
That's the camera.
oh, yeah, thank you for that. All right, so thank you all for coming. It's a little unusual for us to be in a hybrid mode. I first want to introduce myself. I'm Greg Ettl. I'm the chair of David Diaz's PhD committee, and in combination with his committee, which includes online Beth Gardner from SEFS, and in the room there, Turnblom from SEFS, Andy Gray from the Forest Service who's online, and Dave Beck who's here in the room with us. We make up the advisory committee and the ones that will be evaluating David's work. Okay, so this defense is a formal step in the process of earning a PhD. And as such, it requires a formal process, right? First, the committee is present, right? So that's good. We've got over that hurdle. We're roughly on time. These are in the age of Zoom and things, good accomplishments. So I'm pleased with that. The presentation is open to the public. It's also open to all faculty. It's intended that the presentation will allow faculty from other disciplines within our school, but within the college and the university system more broadly, to evaluate David, see what's happening, learn more from his work. Okay, so we will have a set period presentation of about 50 minutes. David will field questions from the audience overall. That is part of the process. If you're online, I encourage you to type something in the chat. Actually, for me, I don't like typing in the chat. I find that little box isn't big enough for me, but maybe like type in something else and then copy it in there. And then you can ask your question in person, but it's nice to have that sort of information within the chat as well for others to see. Okay. So now I have the pleasure of introducing David, who identifies as a fifth generation Texan. He has a BA from Harvard in environmental history and an MS from Oregon State in what I would call soil science. He came to SEFS to pursue his PhD while working for the Portland-based nonprofit company known as EcoTrust. Right, so this role of serving as the director of forest technology, and now I guess director of forest technology and analytics, has been kind of a continuous thing that David has done while pursuing a PhD. I told him repeatedly that was not possible. Like one would not be able to work full time and be able to, but here we are. Right. So apparently it is. David and I have an unlikely academic connection. He came to the UW to gain expertise in machine learning and data analytics. I'm a forest ecologist and a forester. All right. So this is a little bit of a disconnect, but we share this desire, this goal, kind of a passion of trying to move information out of more technical realms to landowners that need information about forests, forest metrics, in terms of being able to make decisions. So, all right, so I've learned a lot from David and lost a lot of hypothetical bets on what machine learning can do. I repeatedly said, no, that's impossible. That's never going to, you're going to have to go measure it in the field. Yeah, all right. So his ability to sort of, if you will, get a hold of all the knowledge needed to tackle all the work that he's going to, well, most of the work that he'll touch on a little bit today, is somehow, I think, a demonstration of this boundless nature of the UW, which often sounds kind of corny to me, but in this case, really allowed David to harness a bunch of academic firepower that otherwise I don't think people could get a hold of it. All right, his dissertation took a problem-solving approach, which kind of matches his role at EcoTrust, and some of these questions have an overlap or an inspiration from EcoTrust. And I'll phrase the questions in a way that might be a little bit different, but first one, how does forest management policy affect wood carbon storage? Second one, how can forest stand boundaries and forest measurements be determined without actually being in the forest? Right, to me, this is a nightmare. Don't you want to go in the forest and measure? But to others, this is a dream come true. We will never go again. We will just fly over it and it'll be everything we need. And then finally, how can we build an open source, I'll call it climate smart ready forest growth model. And that's a modification of this forest vegetation simulator. All right. So his presentation today is meant to be general in nature, and we'll touch on all of these topics a bit and go in more depth than some, and know that we've been down numerous rabbit holes to make sure that things were working approximately the way we thought they were, and none of that is presented. So there's probably about 5 chapters worth of little tidbits of stuff that still could see the light of day, but probably never will. All right, and with that, I pass it to you.
Thank you, Greg. Let's dive in. So excited to be here with all of you, mostly on Zoom. I'm not going to be monitoring the chat, but we have a couple other co-hosts here, so feel free to drop in questions, but I probably won't answer them until the end. So make sure everyone in the room is okay. Is the light all right, or do you guys want me to do that?
I got that.
Okay, so diving in, there's kind of 2 controlling themes that are going to crop up in kind of each of the chapters of my dissertation that I'm going to preview today. So one is that there's an explosion of open data occurring right now. And this is giving us unprecedented opportunities to conduct actionable science. This is across domains. This is not limited to forestry. But the second component of that is, as a forester, I'm particularly excited about the opportunities to apply all of this data and new algorithms and computing power, specifically to understand forests and predict how they're going to change in the future. For a variety of interests. And so over the course of this presentation, we're going to talk through 3 applications of this kind of frame. And so one is we're going to first dive in increasing levels of depth. We're going to do a quick overview of forest policy and trade-off analysis using open data. Then we're going to talk about mapping forests with remote sensing. And then we'll dive more deeply into an effort to update the most widely used growth and yield model in the United States. So starting with the policy analysis. The original motivation for this was with the construction of the Bullitt Center in Seattle. So the Bullitt Center was certified to the Living Building Challenge. I believe it was the first commercial building, office building that was being certified to this. And they came to us with what I thought was a pretty simple question at the time. And they said, we've already evaluated the carbon footprint of our building based on using wood rather than using concrete or steel. But one of the requirements of this certification is that we use wood that has been certified to the Forest Stewardship Council. And so we know there's requirements associated with forest practices that we think have an impact on the carbon footprint of the wood that we're using. What is that? So that was a pretty, seemed like a pretty innocuous question, but was a very deep rabbit hole. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we found out today. So some of the bigger questions beyond this, single foundation coming to us and asking us about a smooth building to kind of ground this in is that buildings in the built environment are a huge contributor to global warming. We have about 40% of annual global greenhouse gas emissions coming from buildings, and building stock is expected to double by 2060. And there has been an increasing transition in the design build community to recognize that instead of focusing, previously there was almost an exclusive focus on reducing operational emissions from a building, being more energy efficient and things like that. About a quarter of the footprint of a building is incurred before you even open the doors. And so how you source materials and select among supply chains to get the materials that go into your building have become an increasing concern, particularly when you think about trying to take actions now or within the next 20 years to try to avoid some of the most catastrophic effects of climate change. And so as a forester, one of the bigger questions that drew me into this was that a recognition that forest management matters. And people that are using wood should be asking questions about how forests are managed. And we have many examples in the United States and around the world of millions of acres of forest land that are already being managed intentionally to sequester additional carbon while still delivering forest products. And so beyond this kind of built environment case, there's lots of investment and there's lots of policy development going on that beg the question, if we encourage more of this, what will happen? What types of trade-offs should we expect? So in 2018, we produced this article that was published in the journal Forests. What we did was we used open data from the gradient nearest neighbor data set produced by researchers out of Oregon State University. And we selected a diverse sample of properties across Western Oregon and Washington. This is kind of the wood basket of the Pacific Northwest, where we produce the lion's share of timber, softwood lumber coming out of this part of the world. Although we have a very small footprint in terms of area compared to forest area in the rest of the country, we have an outsized footprint in terms of the volume of products coming off of that landscape. It's some of the most productive timberland in the world. So we took this open data, divided it into management units, and ran through about 250,000 simulations of alternative management scenarios. Applying a carbon offset accounting methodology to that, we compared how carbon storage, both in the forest and in wood products, compared among these different scenarios. And we evaluated both the timber production over time, the carbon storage over time, and cash flow over time. So really trying to get at some of these critical trade-offs that landowners, policymakers, and builders are going to be particularly interested in. One of the major findings we had was that forest management does matter. You know, there's not any big surprises there. In general, leaving bigger trees on the landscape for larger periods of time translates into a carbon benefit. That can also, when done appropriately, can also translate into increased timber output as well. But when we looked in particular at the requirements of the Forest Stewardship Council certification, which required larger riparian buffers, more green tree retention when harvests were done, those two practices in particular, we found that they always translated to an increased carbon benefit, but that it came with an important opportunity cost. And so closing the gap between these alternative forms of management with business as usual would require some additional incentive or policies to have them adopted more broadly. Okay, that was chapter 1. Chapter 2, we're going to talk about mapping forests. So the motivation for this work came from doing a decision support technology development in my role at EcoTrust. So this is a photo of me giving a presentation at Clackamas Tree School. So this is a university extension event organized by Oregon State every year. And for the past, since 2016, have been delivering workshops like this to family forest owners and consulting foresters who are starting out on management planning. And so one of the things we realized as we were getting into this was that while there were several landowners that were interested in doing scenario comparison of saying what happens if I manage my land this way or that way, a far larger number of them were getting stuck with what is on my property, what is the current state of the forest in my property. And so as they were trying to get into management planning, this was a major bottleneck, and it was delaying or even preventing landowners from completing written management plans because the work to actually gather that information could take weeks or months, or it could cost several $1,000s if they were working with a professional forester. So to address that, we set out to try to automate a lot of that work that previously involved going to a county office or going to 5 or 6 different websites and saying we can actually scrape a lot of that together. And so we produced this application called Land Mapper. You can see the link to it there and go give it for a test drive. It currently covers all of Oregon. And one of the major gaps that we have there of data that's not publicly available is that we wanted to provide forest type maps and forest structure maps across the state of Oregon. And we wanted to update that regularly. And so what we needed to come up with was a reproducible workflow where we could take satellite imagery in particular and make wall-to-wall maps across the entire state on at least an annual basis. And so the types of things that we're trying to map are listed down here: canopy cover, canopy height or dominant tree height, average tree diameter, basal area per acre, number of trees per acre, and biomass or carbon per acre. So the way we went about that was taking what was technically data in the public domain and actually trying to gather it to where it could be released into the public more accessibly. So each of these agencies, the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and Washington Department of Natural Resources have independently developed pretty extensive survey campaigns to collect field data about forests, specifically with the goal of correlating it with remote sensing. So each of them had different Earth observation systems they were planning to correlate it with. And none of them were sharing the data with each other. So I looked at that and said, you guys could double or triple your sample size if you actually share data with each other. You're all public agencies. This is all in the public domain. Why don't we try to borrow strength from all the work that y'all are doing? And so by combining all of these through a combination of public records requests and emailing and getting on the phone with people, lots of Dropbox sharing of data and things like that, compiled several thousand plots covering most of the forested ecoregions of the Pacific Northwest. And so we've got a breakdown here in this table that kind of shows you how many plots we have in each different region, and that we are comparing them to develop models from both LiDAR data and satellite data. So one of the important things that we do here is that we have this ground-based plot information, and then we need to intersect it with a variety of different LiDAR flights, and then with satellite imagery that each have a different repeat frequency in terms of when the data are available, but also create this opportunity or challenge of the plot is measured in 2013, but the LiDAR flight isn't done until 2014 or 2015. So I'm happy to chat a little bit more if there are questions about how you do that or how you filter that. So we fit a bunch of models to do this. So using the scikit-learn package in Python, we fit linear models that have different types of regularization, either lasso or elastic net. We fit a k-nearest neighbors model. We fit random forest and gradient boosting machines. I'm not going to get into the details of each of these algorithms, but you know, we take some of these that are widely used across the sector right now to do forest mapping and things like that and try to figure out if there's trade-offs among them. We tune and evaluate these using held out data and using a process called nested cross validation. And we used a weighting process, recognizing that the samples that were collected by the agencies were not an unbiased representation of the landscape that we are mapping. So the models that we fit are fit using either LiDAR or satellite data. One of the things we wanted to evaluate was whether or not we could produce maps that were good enough using satellite imagery alone. So that was the main reason that we separated these two. Obviously, you could fit a model that used both as well. But so we have some high-level description of the types of variables that are used here. You know, for satellite, it's primarily coming from the Sentinel-2 satellites. And then we also have some Landsat-derived disturbance metrics there. For LiDAR, we're not using a raw point cloud. We processed it into a raster and generated 17 different predictor variables that talk about how stuff is located within the canopy to the ground. We were really interested in evaluating how well models can transfer from one region to another. So one of the big questions here is, if I've collected data from the Blue Mountains, how worried should I be about applying that on the Columbia Plateau? Or how worried should I be about taking a model trained in the Cascade Range and applying it to the coast? And so we developed a variety of regional holdout methods to do that. And so there are kind of 4 different types of data partitioning that we did here to train different models. And the first one is kind of what's currently kind of common practice is that you collect data from a single region, you train a model with the data from that region, and you apply it in that region. If you want to go to another region, you ignore the data you collected before, you collect data in that region, you train a model in that region, you apply it in that region. And we have an idea now that's getting at kind of a naive way of transferring models, of collecting data, which you call outsider. So you train a model with data from one region, and then you apply it in another. We have the next kind of stage here is now realizing that we have data collected from multiple regions. What do you do there? And so we have a model that we call a visitor model, where you actually get to see data from all the ecoregions except the region that you're applying it to. So here we're really trying to get at, by seeing lots of diverse data, even if it's not from the area where you're applying it, can you do a good job? Then we have a global model, which is kind of the desired type of model that we would ultimately like to use in the age of big data, of eat all the data you can and apply it everywhere it makes sense. Okay, so this is a snapshot of several of the variables that we were predicting. I'll orient you to these graphs here a bit. So on the y-axis, on the y-axis, we're showing the a performance metric, the normalized root mean square error. We generated metrics also with mean absolute error and R squared, things like that as well. But so on the top row are showing LiDAR-derived models, and the bottom row are showing satellite-derived models. Within each graph, we have these clusters of bars that are showing those visitor models, the outsider models, the insiders, and the global models. And then within each one of those clusters, we've color-coded it by the algorithm that was used. So some of the main takeaways to see here, whether we're looking at canopy cover in the first column or dominant height in the second column, we generally find this pattern that training a model in one region and applying it in another creates a lot of uncertainty or variability about how well those models will transfer. Just making the step from having a visitor model to a model that's seeing data from lots of regions, but not the region it's trained in, makes a huge improvement in performance. So we're starting to get a sense that there is generalization capability that all of these models have. But when we actually get access to data from the target region, we see another smaller leap this time of improving performance. Then within each of the algorithms, we generally find this pattern that's pretty consistent of k nearest neighbors is generally the worst performer. The linear models are often trading place with random forests, depending on which data set, which region they were trained in and applied in. And in general, gradient boosting machines tend to show up at the top in terms of best performance. And that's across performance metrics and target variables that we were trying to predict. And this is another way of looking at that when we could rank each of these different models across all the different regions where they were being applied. And so what we show is focusing in particular on the insider and the global models. It doesn't really make sense in practice to use a visitor model or to use an outsider model if you can use insider data. So the bigger questions we were trying to get at is, should I limit my models only to data from the target region, or is there some benefit to feeding them data from other regions that are not from other regions? And so what we saw in general was that gradient boosting global LiDAR models were almost always at the top of pretty much every prediction. We saw the satellite models, a bifurcation where the LiDAR models were almost always better and statistically significantly better than the satellite-based models. And then, like I was describing earlier, we kind of have this pattern where gradient boosting shows up at the top. Depending on which variable you'll look at, you'll see this jockeying between the linear models and random forests, and then k nearest neighbors is almost always at the bottom. Yeah, and with the linear models, we didn't see a strong difference between global and insider models, so they didn't show as big of an impact of having access to other data as the machine learning models did. When we look at how they actually perform in terms of observations versus predictions, we're again looking at a subset of the variables here, with the observed value shown on the x-axis and the predicted value on the y-axis. Similar to the previous graphs, we've got the top row showing the LiDAR-based models, and the bottom row is showing the satellite-based models. And in general, we see pretty high fidelity for most of the variables that are being predicted, but whether it's satellite data or LiDAR data, we're still having this saturation effect that's really commonly observed and reported from satellite-based models of forest stocking, where you tend to underpredict the volume or biomass, for example, that occurs in forests that have a lot of it. In the case of satellite models, we also have a similar bias happening at the opposite end of the spectrum, where we're tending to overpredict canopy cover, dominant height, average diameter in forests that have relatively small canopy cover height, tree size, etc. Yeah, and I don't get a whole lot into the impact of weighting, of doing the sample weighting that I mentioned to try to address this what's called domain shift or bias in the sample compared to the target landscape that you're applying the model across. But the red line is showing what that weighted model looks like compared to the raw, just using training models based on the raw data without any weighting. So we didn't see a very large effect, but in many circumstances, it increased bias at the far end, of it increased the saturation effect that I described right there. Okay, so some of the key findings or takeaways from that. The gradient boosting machines model generalized very well, particularly when you fed it a large data set. We saw this big leap for most of the models, but for gradient boosting in particular, when we jumped from the visitor to the outsider types of models. We didn't see a lot of other studies that have used much smaller data sets and tried to transfer across similar regions, found that there's a significant bias that would creep in when you do this type of transfer. We did not see that this time. And our intuition there is that we're feeding machine learning models what they need, which is lots of data. So once they can generalize better when you feed them more data. And the LiDAR models were always better. So when you have LiDAR data, you should use it. But for the use case that we were trying to work towards, non-industrial forest owners, trying to develop stewardship plans without going out in the woods, or spending a limited amount of time out in the woods doing quantitative work, we determined that we're meeting those needs. And so particularly when we think about the types of information that go into these stewardship plans of classifying canopy cover into broad categories, or classifying diameter into broad size classes, that will mitigate some of the bias that we were seeing from the satellite models in particular. And now we have a reproducible pipeline that allows us to generate these maps across. We've done it across Oregon and Washington. Right now we're doing it on a single server, but we can do it in about 4 to 8 hours. So obviously if we move this, we're only doing this once a year, so that is not a real problem. But obviously there's opportunities to migrate workflows like this to the cloud and use distributed computing to make this happen almost instantaneously. Okay. I'm going to dive into growth and yield. What we're talking about doing here is refitting a growth and yield model called the Forest Vegetation Simulator. And one of the equations that exists within it, this is for predicting the diameter growth of trees larger than 3 inches in diameter. And we gathered open data from the US Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, which is a national network of inventory plots that are remeasured over time. And some of the motivating questions we had was, can we simplify the equations that are used in these models, make them consistent across ecoregions, and can we adopt a new approach to learning across regions and eating data across multiple regions that allow us to recognize uncertainty in an intuitive way, but also simultaneously fit these models across large landscapes beyond individual ecoregions. And so what we can see here, this is how the Forest Vegetation Simulator is currently organized. There are, they call them regional variants. So there's a PN is the Pacific Coast variant, WC is the West Cascades variant. And each one of these, here you have the Northern California coast, the Sierras, et cetera. And so traditionally, the way these models have been fit is that You collect inventory data from those regions, you fit equations that are customized for that region to the data from that region. You ignore the data that's just over the boundary of that region that actually has trees that probably grow in not the same way, but in a similar way. So we think there's an opportunity there to learn across borders like this that trees don't see. So like I mentioned earlier, why FVS and why refit? It is the most widely used growth and yield model in the United States. It's being used for carbon project development. It's being used for forest planning. State and federal agencies use it for both stand level silvicultural planning and for strategic planning. And what we've seen in many instances, and this is not just me, this is a variety of other researchers have documented similar patterns in other regions, is that out of the box, using default settings, FVS can give you wildly large predictions of growth. And so what we're showing here in this graph is actually from the supplemental material of the first chapter that I presented earlier. And these gray lines are showing what FVS default predictions are for different site productivity classes. And we're looking at cubic volume per acre on the y-axis and stand age on the x-axis. So we expect to see this kind of yield curve, over time increasing and starting to plateau as the growth slows and the stand gets older. And we have forests going from less productive to more productive in terms of site classes, broader site classes shown in each of these columns. And what we're comparing it against these are yield curves that have been used in industry and research science for some of them go back 100 years at this point. So this is what people have been using as kind of rules of thumb based on going and measuring a bunch of stands. And these blue lines are actually showing places where they've gone back and remeasured the same forest over and over again. And in this bottom set of graphs here, we're showing the FIA data. So when we stratify the FIA data by age classes, what types of volume do we see across all of those? And so consistently, what you just see, regardless of how productive the site is, FVS out of the box is way overshooting. And that has a lot of implications for timber, for carbon, for cash. So you can imagine why we were interested in reining that in. So to use the FIA data, one of the main concerns we have is mitigating something called fall down. So professional foresters, I've heard professional foresters, in the field call this model of fall up. But basically, there's been a historic practice of throwing out messy data. So when you set up a research study and you have insects come in and kill a bunch of trees, or there's a fire that comes in or something like that, that's not, let's not use that data. Let's use the data from the forests that have been undisturbed. And what ends up happening with that is you have a kind of self-selection bias of using data only from undisturbed forests, and then you don't recognize the fact that you're applying it to forests that are being disturbed on a regular basis at a variety of intensities. So what we're interested in doing is capturing some level of disturbance based on what we think it's appropriate for users to be able to specify when they're using the model. So we're getting all the data. We start by getting all the data from remeasured plots. We're trying to predict diameter growth over time, so we want to know how much the diameter changed from one field visit to another. We got data from all the trees that have been remeasured on an FIA plot in California, Oregon, or Washington. We removed any plots that had disturbances involving harvest, fire, or landslides or avalanches, things like that. Those are things that we said it's probably reasonable to expect a user to say, there's a fire that's going to happen, or that I'm going to set, or I want to know what happens if a wildfire occurs, or if I do a harvest. Whereas things like insects or pathogens, wind disturbance, and invasive species, things like this, are things that are reported on these plots, but are the types of things that a very large number of landowners don't actually monitor and inventory in a quantitative way. So your ability to actually specify them in a model is pretty limited. And we also have examples where when people go back and measure trees, the diameter shrinks over time. There's a variety of reasons that can occur. But when we see the diameter shrink so much that it's clearly not an observation, just a measurement error in terms of maybe the tape was a little bit higher on the tree the last time and now it's here this time. The FIA program has measurement quality objectives that they prescribe and indicate how consistent the diameter measurement should be. When multiple people do it, we throw those out. So we do still allow negative measurements to occur, but they're only allowed within a limited range that we think can be attributable to measurement error alone, and not measuring a different tree or having a tree that had a huge change in it over time. We fit this for the 6 most abundant species in 4 coastal ecoregions. So it's the PN region, West Cascades, Northern California coast, and Sierra. Excuse me, they call this the Climate Mountains variant. And so we end up with this big list of species over here, including both softwoods and hardwoods, commercially important and not. And we gather data not just from our target ecoregions, but also from these other ecoregions further east, hoping that there's something that we can learn from them as well. And so we end up with a pretty large sample of species that we can learn from. And what we're dealing with is an equation that predicts a diameter increment or something very closely related to a basal area increment. In its implementation, it actually predicts something called diameter difference squared. That's not an important detail here, but basically we're predicting how much the size of the tree changes over 2 time steps. That prediction is made from 3 basic components: the current size of the tree at the start of the growth period, site level conditions, and competition indicators. To extend this model, we also said we think there's unexplained variation that's occurring at multiple scales. Some of it that's occurring at the scale of what FBS calls a location, which is basically what's your nearest national forest. So they use this to try to provide some smaller than region scale variation across that. And then we also have plot level variation that we explain with random effects. We fit this into a stochastic model and also have process-based error, where we say my prediction of diameter at every time step has some variability in it that's not varying at these other spatial scales. We're taking an equation that in FBS currently looks like this. When you unpack it, what you'll see is that for each species in each region, different variables are used. You're rarely using all 18 variables to make predictions, but there are many instances in which there are variables that are intended to indicate the same thing that are being used. So you'll use 2 different variables of stand level competition, for example. And you'll use for different species, they'll use slightly different variables and things like that. So one of the questions that we run into with this is now, does that actually give you anything beneficial? Or are we just fitting very small variations in the data that when you collect new data, you'll choose a different model? So we wanted to ask, is it practically different from one another in terms of our predictive ability? Because it'll make it a lot easier for researchers and developers, software developers and engineers, to maintain the model if it's not customized for every species in every region. Yeah, so that was a lot. And what we want to do is something like this. So we came up with a model that we said, this is data that is readily available from every forest inventory. We don't need other regression equations to try to predict any variables. These are all give us single attributes related to the site quality, related to the size of the tree, and related to competition at the stand level and the tree level. And so we would like to test a model that doesn't have as many quadratic terms, doesn't have as many collinear variables, et cetera. And so we just want to see how well that would work. To fit the model, we use something called the state space model, or an errors and variables model. This is kind of an illustration of it here on the left. And the major contribution of an errors and variables approach is that you say there's something that I measure, and I measure it always with error. So there's a true state of the thing I'm trying to predict that I don't have a perfect observation of. And so in this instance, there's 2 different types of observations that we're able to use. Every single one of these trees has a diameter that was measured with a tape at the start of the growth period and at the end of the growth period. For a subset of the trees, there was also an increment bore, where they bored into the tree and measured the depth of the growth rates. So we have 2 different types of observations there that have different types of measurement error associated with them. So we simulate this kind of true state of the diameter, or what we call unobserved states, using this diameter growth model that I showed in the previous slides. So that evolves over time, and we never get a perfect understanding of what it is, but we do get to see these observations that are collected over time with error. So the DVH at time 0, at time 5, at time 10, or the diameter growth that occurred over the past 5 years or the past 10 years. And so using this kind of Bayesian state space errors and various variables model, we can propagate uncertainty through each of those steps on a 5-year time step and utilize multiple observations and recognize error. So we fit this using a Python package called NumPyro, and we fit this using Markov chain Monte Carlo, in particular the no-U-turn sampler as a form of Hamiltonian Monte Carlo. This paper here is the inspiration for this kind of work of usually using multiple types of measurements in a state space model. We've diverted from it a bit in that this was using very precisely measured tree ring compared to increments measured in the field. The way we compare models is using something called the highest density interval for a predictor variable or performance indicator, and we use something called a region of practical equivalence. So this is what HDI wrote stands for. So the performance indicator that we're using is mean absolute error of the diameter growth that was predicted over a 10-year time step. So 2 5-year time steps are being added together. And then we compare how one model compares to another model. Because we're using a Bayesian model, we actually don't just produce a single point estimate of our predictive error. We actually get a distribution of that error. And so now we're trying to compare 2 distributions and say, is one bigger than the other or one higher than the other? So you can calculate the difference between each of the samples and come up with this kind of distribution of your difference in performance metrics. And the HDI rope rule looks like this. You say, I want the highest density interval of that performance indicator, and I want to compare how it compares, how that performance compares to a region that I say is practically equivalent. So if the model is pretty consistently worse than something that's practically equivalent, then I'm going to deem it inferior. If it's fully within the range of practical equivalence, I'm going to say the models are equivalent. And if the model performance is clearly better for one than the other, beyond a region of practical equivalence, then I'll deem it superior. I haven't illustrated here, but there's also an edge case where the highest density interval overlaps the region of practical equivalence. It can be higher or lower, or it can just totally cover it and not be contained within it. And that's an inconclusive outcome of that test. Okay, so the couple ways that we have to fit this. We have the current FBS pattern, which is you fit a model to data in each region. They're not related to each other in any way. Each model has no idea that there are observations or even models in being fit in other regions. So this is the current pattern that's used in FBS. We'll call it unpooled. We have a hierarchical model that we can use there, where we can say the models are related to each other. The way that the effect of diameter, current diameter, for example, in this region is related to the effect of current diameter in the other regions as well too. And we do that by creating a parent variable or hyperparameter that says they're normally distributed, that the effective diameter, for example, is normally distributed among the regions. So this kind of constrains the variation among the models, but still allows you to get unique model fits in each region. So when we do that comparison for all of these species in each region, we came away with confirmation of some of our initial expectations. So what we show here is this is for each of the species, and then each of these regions are shown in these kind of clusters of columns. For each species and each of the candidate models. There were 17 candidate models, whether we use the full version with all the different candidate variables or a simple paired back one. We had several different, 9 different tree level and stand level competition variables that we considered for both the full and the simple. So we have a benchmark model that we compare against 17 different candidates. And so what we're showing here is how many of those comparisons were inconclusive, how many of those comparisons showed the candidate model better than our preferred benchmark model, and how many of them were equivalent, for example. And what we saw was there was not a single instance for a single species where there was a candidate model that outperformed the benchmark model. So it doesn't mean that there weren't individual instances, but in general, when we look at the performance of these models, we don't see a practical improvement in performance by using anything other than this candidate model for all of these species in all of these regions. We also found when we compared these unpooled models to the hierarchical models, a similar pattern. There was not a single instance in which the unpooled version of the model was deemed superior to the hierarchical version of the model. So when we say we would prefer to use hierarchical models to learn across regions, and we prefer to use a simpler model for practical reasons for maintaining the models, we don't have any performance reason not to do so. So then we also said, well, what did we improve anything compared to current FBS out of the box? And so FBS is not a stochastic model, so it makes point predictions. So we're no longer comparing distributions to each other in terms of performance, but we're comparing the distribution of our Bayesian model to the prediction of FBS. But using that, we kind of apply the same principle behind the HGI work rule. And what we found was in 25 out of the 43 instances, so each instance is a species in a region where it occurs, we saw that our hierarchical benchmark model was deemed superior to FBS. There were 6 instances where FBS was deemed superior, and we had inconclusive comparisons in 8 out of 43. Similar to what I showed at the very beginning, we also found in terms of bias, so all of these comparisons above are being made in terms of mean absolute error. When we look at bias, we saw this pattern that FBS over-predicted diameter growth for every species in every region. So there's clearly some opportunity to improve or reduce that bias, and would like to suggest that this hierarchical model is a great candidate for doing that. So some of the key takeaways that we have from this is that the data stream provided by the FIA program is large and diverse. It allows us to refit FBS on a recurring basis. We can simplify these equations without impacting performance for every species and region that we examine. This adoption of a hierarchical Bayesian approach allowed us to fit models for across multiple regions beyond the current FBS paradigm of individual ecoregion models. The expectation is that this is laying the groundwork for a model that actually can learn how species respond to climate across their species range. So seeing how species respond to drought, for example, increasing temperatures, we don't need to be constrained exclusively by ecoregion boundaries that humans draw that trees don't see. So the Bayesian models in particular have an intuitive way of capturing uncertainty. They allow you to eat different types of observation data at the same time. And at the end of the day, we're optimistic that this could simplify the lives of FBS maintainers pretty significantly. So being able to develop a larger multi-region model that can be refit on a regular basis and in an automated way. I'm hopeful that this can be an important contribution moving forward. There's several people that I definitely want to thank, without whom this wouldn't have been possible. In particular, my supervisor, Greg, and long-running vice president when she was at EcoTrust, Brent Davies, my colleagues, Sarah Lorino and Steph Gutierrez, my mom and dad, my wife, Abby, and my sister, Teresa. I really couldn't have done all of this without a huge amount of support from all of you. There was also a huge number of people that are partners and collaborators and advisors on all of this work. I'm not going to name all of them here, and I'm sure there's some I've also forgotten, but thank you. And there's also a lot of people that contributed funding to this, both through EcoTrust and through the University of Washington. And this is just all the ones that I could think of as well. So with that, we can open it up for any questions.
People you're going to want to see, do you feel comfortable just managing that?
Sure.
I'll try to monitor the chat. See.
Okay. Elaine, you're welcome to type into the chat or to unmute yourself and speak.
I'm going to unmute if you can hear me. That was fabulous, and I have so many questions that I could take an hour, but Greg isn't going to let me do that. So I just know that he's not going to let me do that. A couple, and they're sort of organized, kind of trying to organize them so you can answer it all as one. When I looked at that chart where you had the LiDAR and you're looking at the fit of diameter and height and all those sorts of things, like, well, height fits pretty well, as you'd expect from LiDAR, but the diameter really is an under prediction as the trees get larger. And I'm like, but our diameter equations all are based on exponential diameter, not the biomass equations are fitted to a diameter squared as opposed to height. And it sounds like what you've done is change that. So then the next question is, did you change that when you were reporting out on chapter 1? So all those it's sort of a hierarchy of questions, because this is really fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, good question. So I think when you first asked that question, I was under the impression you're referring to this kind of satellite-based prediction or LiDAR-based prediction. But if I'm hearing you right, I think what you're referring to is when we predict diameter growth with the FVS model, what the equation is designed to predict is basal area increment or diameter difference squared. What the model I presented is evaluating it based on DBH increment. Is that right?
No. So I wasn't.
Okay.
This is exactly the chart where I was like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Because then you use those global LiDAR models to sort of justify why you would look at something globally. And I'm like, that follows what you're doing there. But know that the current biomass equations are based, they basically threw height out and they're focused on diameter. And you've just defined, what you're showing here is those LiDAR equations sort of under predict that diameter. So how did you mush those together and sort of solve that problem with this big data approach? Because the current equations would, you'd basically have to redo the entire equation, and I didn't quite see how you did that.
Yeah, so there's not really I mean, in the case of the linear variables, there is a parametric equation that's being fit, or the linear models. So the elastic net and the lasso models are fitting a linear model, a linear parametric model to fit this. The K nearest neighbors, random forest, and gradient boosting machines are non-parametric models, and they're using different algorithmic approaches to try to predict the raw output variable. And so there's not, kind of a square that's being done. We didn't transform the target variable, if that's part of what you're asking. So we didn't try to predict DBH squared or take the square root of DBH and predict the model off of that or the log of DBH. We did experiment with some of that and didn't see a substantial change in performance. And so said, if I can just feed raw data in and get raw data out, or get the data in the domain that I want out, then that makes my life a little bit easier. But yeah, I think some of the patterns that we're seeing here with the change in predicted performance between canopy cover and height compared to these other models is that the sensors themselves, I believe, are detecting something that is more directly related to things like canopy cover, height, and biomass than it is to things like stem count or individual tree size. So those are things that you can infer, and that we do have these allometric equations that we can relate one to another, and that we're not employing in this instance, but are ways that you could probably further constrain the models, that if we have a pretty good idea that we predict basal area very well and dominant height very well, for example, that given what we know about the relationships between those variables from field data, we could apply a parametric equation to make a prediction of tree count or tree diameter or something like that from that. There's a variety of different extensions, that you can use to do that. But right now, I think it just mostly has to do with the abundance of data across the distributions. So it's not really common to spend a lot of time putting permanent plot measurements in young planted stands. So you don't spend a lot of money measuring trees that are all the size of your pinky. And so I think there's some aspect of this that there's kind of bias in the model that you're training on, but also some, in practical terms, there is a difference in terms of what is the most important section of this range to get the predictions right. So all your concern about accuracy is not going to be the same for predicting the size of a seedling as it is with predicting whether or not you have a merchantable saw log or not, for example. So I think there's also considerations like that will open up a whole can of worms in terms of how do you weight the data or try to adjust for imbalances in the data that we tinkered with a little bit, but didn't go too far down that rabbit hole. So I hope I answered your question. And we have several others that are popping up.
See Ryan watches down.
Yeah, I think, like I said, I could spend a lot of time on this because I'm mostly interested on that larger diameter stuff. Because then when you're taking it into the answering the question that the Bullet Foundation asked you at the beginning, you don't care about the seedling size, you care about that large tree. And if there's this bias, and you're still going to have to fight to correct it. Because it's the diameter that's mattering there, not so much the diameter, but the height.
Yeah, I see what you're asking there. And I think that, as it relates to the practical applications of this, the diameter itself is not the variable that you're most concerned about in an analysis like that. What you're thinking about is the biomass of carbon, and not just that, but the stock change over time. And when you're thinking about a concern of forests that are being managed and are producing wood at the same time, they're very unlikely to be the forests that are at this end of the spectrum. So forests that have 150 metric tons per acre of above ground live tree carbon are not being managed intensively for timber production. So there might be some harvest that's occurring there, but it's likely to be a very small part of the timber supply that any builder is using. So I do think there's some, obviously we would love to have a fit that was great across the entire range. This is something that's pretty persistent across not just my work, but everyone that's using remote sensing data is kind of observing a similar pattern like this. So I think I don't have a great solution off the top of my head. I think if I did, I would present it. I see a question from Ryan. I hope to be able to play with the model or data sometime soon. Is there a branch of FBS code with your proposed model or overhaul implemented? No, Ryan, there is not. That's a great question. So one of the things that I'm very excited about is that there is a lot of work going on within the Forest Service and with a broad group of researchers and industry professionals, forest managers and modelers all around the United States, trying to figure out what are the most important research and development priorities for improving that model and other models like it. And so there is kind of a transition that's occurring within the Forest Service. They've made the growth model publicly available. You can see the code on GitHub now, but you can't contribute to it. So there are collaborative steps to do community development of the model that haven't yet emerged, that do need to emerge before this type of stuff would happen. In the meantime, what I'm imagining we would do here is actually just create a fork, like you said, or a branch of FBS code where we actually just replace hard-coded variables in it with the ones that we fit and say, here's another version of FBS. I'm reluctant to do that right now because I don't want to distract attention away from the production version of the model being where we want all of these contributions to go. But I suspect that once we actually get into community-based development, that type of thing will become more common practice and will be ultimately where we go. The other aspect of this, Ryan, is that there's, for most of the users that aren't like you and me and compiling software and running it, having an executable is actually what the vast majority of FBS users would need to do this. So I think the code contribution is an important step, but before we go out and start producing pirated versions of FBS, for other users, would like to try to work this through the FBS team and collaborate with the Forest Service directly.
So let's ask Ryan if he wants to follow up at all.
Yeah, Ryan, do you have any follow-ups to that?
No, I appreciate the answer, and I'm interested in maybe working some time on that, on creating that fork. And I wouldn't say pirated version so much as maybe a subversive release of FBS.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I see Kate's question about fiddling with FBS equations and which ones we chose and why. Okay, or which parameters we chose and why. Yeah, so initially when I started out playing with this equation, I did kind of take a brute force approach of saying, well, let's try every possible combination of it and refit the new model. And the Bayesian models that we were fitting would take several hours per species. So that became a little bit challenging to do it in the full Bayesian context. We did do it in a point estimate context as well. We're using variational inference, which still is kind of related to it's related to Bayesian analysis. But we ended up choosing these variables in particular because compared to these transformations of things like the sine of aspect times slope or the cosine of aspect times slope, you know, that's a variable that by the time we get to a climate version of FBS, we're hopeful that that will actually come in directly as incident radiation, for example. This is basically exposure that is trying to be calculated here. There's similar things like elevation that are proxies for other drivers of forest growth that we'll probably also want to reconsider when we get to fitting a climate version of FBS. There was in general just this like, do we need a squared term? And instead of testing every single, like, what if we take out slope squared? What if we don't take out slope squared? What if we also take out pound ratio squared or don't? We said, well, let's just say something that we think is credible and easy enough to use and just see if there's a practical difference. So the variables that we left in are there's this two transformations of the current DBH that are used in the original introduction of this model by Wyckoff. There's a really beautiful illustration that shows how flexible these particular transformations of DBH are for capturing diameter growth at small diameters and large diameters. So it's you could certainly torture that with more cubic terms and things like that or other transformations. But that was just kind of sticking with the way it's been done before. And then when we look at these two variables, these are the two competition variables that we chose. And so one is the amount of basal area in trees larger than the tree that's being grown. And that the basal area of larger trees divided by the transformation of the current size of the tree. So this is essentially an interaction term. So what we liked about this was that it was recognizing that tree level and stand level competition are related to each other. So having an interaction term makes intuitive sense. We still, however, see in the coefficients that come out that I didn't present here, that we had a counterintuitive outcome, for example, where stand level competition appears to have a positive influence on growth, which ecologically doesn't make sense. But that's what the model suggests is the best fit to the data. So, you know, although we have the opportunity in the Bayesian approach to constrain the parameters to only be positive, to be skewed in a particular way, and things like that, we opted not to do that and still follow a linear modeling approach to this. But these were all models that, compared to using something like crown competition factor, which requires you to fit another regression equation to inventory data and to estimate how much space trees would fill if they were open grown, for example. We said, if we can avoid doing that, let's not. If we can derive all the estimates directly from inventory data, that will make everyone's lives a little easier. I hope that answers the question. You have any follow-up on that?
No, that's great. Thanks. I look forward to digesting this a bit and getting back to you.
That
has a request, but then will entertain maybe one more question from the general audience if there's something there that somebody feels would be helpful for us.
So Beth, is this the slide that you were asking about?
Yep, I got the shot. Thank you.
Okay, great.
And then Margaret Evans asked a question.
And Margaret Evans, I wonder if that inferred positive effect of competition might be picking up stand level variation in productivity. A more productive stand has higher stand density. That's possible there could be an interaction that we're not capturing here. We do have site index as one of the drivers of the model, which should be getting at productivity. It is related to tree height and the trend of growth of tree height over time, as opposed to volume increment or biomass increment, for example. And there are a lot of questions about how to use or collect site index in a changing climate, how reliable an indicator that is. But yeah, there's not a clear explanation that we've been able to, that's fallen into our laps, you know, for why we're seeing this kind of pattern. One of the hypotheses we have is that the FIA data, although when it's collected, it does differentiate between industry timberland and non-industry timberland, where you have much more intensive management occurring in terms of vegetation control. Often, you're planting trees as opposed to allowing a lot of artificial, natural regeneration. And there may be improved stock that are being used, either genetically selected or something like that. And so we thought maybe those stands that are denser are actually a proxy for improved or intensively managed stands that we're not able to unravel. But we don't have, there's no smoking gun that we've been able to find right now. So I am hopeful as well too, that once we start getting more of the climatic drivers of this, that it will help untangle some of these competition factors a little bit more. And I'd love to kind of move these equations over time to something that is getting at, instead of competition as a proxy, getting at how you think it affects availability of water, or how you think it affects availability of light, as opposed to just using something like basal area. That will be for other PhDs to do in the future. You have any follow-up on that, Margaret?
No, that's great. That's wonderful. I just wanted to hear you sort of hear what you had to say about it, what you think about it. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Great.
Okay, maybe a comment.
Yeah.
That I think is kind of useful.
Yeah.
Which is, maybe you can read that. So
Yeah.
Recap it, and then
Yeah.
should kind of try to wrap up.
Yeah. This I think is a pretty quick one as well. I won't wax poetic about this. So yes, a big part of that longer term projection that I showed about why refit does have to do with the interaction of growth and mortality. To Elaine's point right here, the FBS has known problems both with growth predictions and with mortality predictions and biases that occur across the range of trees and species. In this particular instance, we're predicting for a single 10-year increment and only for trees that were all alive at both time steps. So the prediction of mortality is not coming into play in propagating error in these predictions that we're making here. When you actually try to feed these equations or updated things into FVS, that type of interaction is going to be critically important to get right. And so fitting a model just for diameter growth or just for mortality and trying to smash them together and expect that they'll reproduce what you see in the forest is not a guarantee. So there is more of a data assimilation approach that's probably required here, where you simultaneously predict growth and mortality and tune both of those models at the same time against observational data. And yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you to everybody online for coming. And we'll eventually end this Zoom meeting and start another, but just to let you know, then now we'll go into a private session here. Thank you again.